So you've already had companies saying, okay, you don't want us to be in China. We will move outside. We will, we'll play that game. We'll move our facilities outside of China, reestablish ourselves. And now they're being hit with tariffs again.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, welcome, folks. It's the Simply Trade Podcast Canadian edition with Warrington, Ellacott here from the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters once again. And I'm joined today by a very good friend of ours with the association, Sean Stephenson, who's counsel at Dentons here in Toronto. Sean runs an international and trade sanctions practice, and I'm sure you've been doing nothing over the last couple of days, right, Sean?
It's been a busy one for, I think, for most trade lawyers.
Yeah, you think? Okay. All right. Well, as listeners will recall, I had a conversation with Martha Harrison on the 25th of March, and we were talking about being dated, and sure enough, the next day, the U.S. auto tariffs hit. So I'm sure we're going to be dated here. So I will date stamp this. We're recording this on Thursday, April the 3rd at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So there we go. As per usual, I'll give a little political update. As the listeners will know, we have a Canadian election going. We have 24 days left. Voting day is April 28th. And at the moment, it's projected that the Liberals will win a majority. But again, folks, it's a coin flip. We really don't know what's going to happen. So enough of that. Let's get to the trade policy discussion. And I think, Sean, let's kick it off with an analysis as best we can to the announcement on the 26th with respect to the U.S. auto tariffs. They apply to all countries. Parts are not subject to the activity just yet, right? That's coming up on or about May 3rd. But it does apply to all automotive products, and there is a carve-out for USMCA autos. So I'm interested in your perspective of what that all fell out.
Yeah, look, I mean, now we obviously have some of that in force as of yesterday, and we are obviously seeing an immediate fallout of that as well with the announcements across the board in Stellantis, where in Canada we've had at least a 2-week pause on production. We saw, immediate dismissals in the United States, and then in Mexico as well, a further pause. So they've had an immediate effect on production. It's created, a significant amount of uncertainty. And I think people are still trying to digest the particular rules and the particular application of USMCA origin rules and how that will apply to autos and other parts. So, right now, I think we'll see what happens. There's always time, before the sort of next tranche enters into force. But from what we've seen today is an immediate and significant impact on.
Yeah, now there was guidance was issued, I guess, last night, right, by CBP to set forth the rules of engagement there. But I think the other rule that's important here is there's no drawback opportunity on those, correct?
Yeah, and that's consistent with the U.S. position sort of across the board on most of these tariffs is drawback is not applicable. So that, that really hampers the ability of autos, OEMs, parts manufacturers to at least engage in that, even though that would have been, a likely costly scenario where they have to, pay the tariff up front and then reclaim that. The lack of drawback on the U.S. side of things is, it's particularly costly to autos, but I mean costly across the board for U.S. tariffs and just integrated supply chains.
And I think one of the most complicated things about the rule was how the determination of U.S. content or to apply for certain exemptions under USMCA and under the rule. And I don't think those rules have been fully fleshed out. Is that correct?
That's my understanding to date. Yeah, I mean we're looking for specific content rules that are going to give further clarity on this. But I think this is part and parcel of the tariff story of announcements made with not a lot of certainty, and then sort of backfilling the tariff response as we go. It's wildly hard for businesses to plan. Particularly in complex supply chains. So, we're still waiting for, I think, some clarity on that, and hopefully we can get that as soon as possible.
All right. Well, we can move on to yesterday's events on April 2nd, and I want to start before we get into the sort of the foreign thing. I wanted to start with the China de minimis rule, which was kind of hidden in the background, not a lot of press around it. But yesterday, the president did sign an executive order to effectively eliminate the China de minimis rule. And it is activated on both postal and delivery platforms. And it begins on May 2nd with increasing tariffs. And I know that some Canadian businesses were caught in the first iteration of the rule, and they may have had a China good that they brought to Canada, and then they deployed that to the United States and were caught. But this, to me, is also a very substantive activity that came out of yesterday, right? Super
substantive and to a certain extent surprising. I mean, this was initially imposed in the initial wave in February, and it was there for about 2 days and wreaked so much havoc on ports, on the infrastructure, because there's just the volume of de minimis low value goods, and particularly in the United States where that is $800. They just weren't equipped to deal with this. So the fact that it's come back so quickly, you have to ask yourselves, well, what changes have been made between February and sort of early February and now, right? It's a period of 2 months. Have they fundamentally reworked the infrastructure so we won't see the same chaos? So there's questions, but it's come back, and obviously that's going to have a significant impact on U.S. consumers that are buying direct, and obviously U.S. B2B purchases as well. That probably some of which could probably fall under that de minimis threshold.
Yeah, and Martha and I talked about the importance of origin, right? Like this activity that's taking place is putting so much emphasis on origin. I think the listeners have got to get that under control, right?
It's incredibly important, right? And it's as a consumer or as somebody who buys something, knowing where your goods are actually coming from, and then that can be tricky because origin can be you could be buying. Obviously, there's a significant amount of transplants that have happened in throughout the Asia Pacific region. So, we're talking about, Vietnam, Malaysia, India. That could still be a Chinese origin good. So you could be buying from a vendor that, seemingly the good could be coming from, Vietnam. But so I think transshipment here is going to be a massive issue, and CBP is really going to be looking at that and cracking down on it.
Yeah, so that's a great segue into, the foreign aspects of yesterday's events. And, yesterday the president enacted basically a 10% flat tariff on all countries. And then there was a list of which is going to come into effect on April 5th. And then there was a subsequent list of a number of countries that had higher rates of duty, anywhere between 20 to 49%. And that's on a country by country basis. And the basis of that was the IEEPA. It was a national emergency framework, as we've seen before. There was some exclusions in the EO, which was 232 articles. But generally speaking, most goods, finished goods, were impacted by the activity. And most predominantly, I think there was a lot of interest on the China number. but also a number of other countries, as you mentioned. Vietnam was targeted, South Korea, Japan, just to name a few. And I think this is going to create more uncertainty in the supply chain, because folks are going to try to understand, well, is this going to stick? Is it going to change? If it does change, am I going to move to another country, another vendor, and then this all changes and I lose my advantage? So I'm interested in how you guys at Denton kind of viewed things last night, and how you were advising your clients sort of last night and this morning.
Well, I'll speak for myself.
Yeah.
But look, when you look at the list of countries that are included in that annex, and particularly sort of the South Asian countries, Cambodia, India, Malaysia, Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand. Taking a step back from yesterday, we have already seen or started to see that shift from people who wanted to get out of China and get out of the China tariffs. So you've already had companies saying, okay, you don't want us to be in China. We will move outside. We will, we'll play that game. We'll move our facilities outside of China, reestablish ourselves. And now they're being hit with tariffs again. So this is going to rip through supply chains. There is so much manufacturing going on in those types of countries, outside that is outside of China, right? I mean, we can talk about the China tariffs alone, where you had, I think the average was about 42% pre-yesterday. So we're at an average rate of 76%. And then there's the potential for Venezuelan tariffs, those secondary tariffs to come on as well. So China massively impacted, but also all of those other companies who've said, okay, great, we will relocate outside of China now. So, that is, you think of just, apparels, right?
Right, apparel. Yeah, that came to my mind immediately.
Coming out of Vietnam, that's coming out of Thailand, that's coming out of all of those places, all going to be impacted by this. So, I mean, look, a significant supply chain impact that I think we're going to see. And you saw some of those companies and their stock prices just absolutely tank as these things.
Yeah, the markets are not taking it very well today. That's for sure. The other thing that came to my mind was too, we hinted to it last conversation I had with Martha, but any Canadian companies that had commingled their stock in the United States first and did not have that stock in a bonded facility would now be exposed to those other countries and those other tariff rates with no drawback opportunities, right? So that's another significant cost hit for, at least Canadian businesses under that. And of course, obviously our US friends are fishing that today. So, and I don't think that we fully understand the scope of this just yet. I think the Europeans are contemplating a response. We'll get to the Canadian response here in a second. And we saw China, South Korea, and Japan had a discussion the other day to see what activity they could, to mitigate the aspects. So I think time will tell what's going to happen here from a global trading perspective. But I'm interested in how you view this rule in the construct of the global trading system. Do we still have one?
I mean, look, it's a great question. It's a significantly broader question.
I know it was a purposeful question.
we do. It's there. I think the trading system is there and can withstand this. I think part of the issue here is messaging. The Trump administration has, obviously not clearly communicated what they are trying to do. They have not given people time to adjust. I think this might be some of the President Trump himself, where he wanted, a spectacle yesterday. This wasn't a policy that was rolled out and said, look, the world is changing and trade patterns need to change with it. And this, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Follow us. It was an announcement that nobody really knew about, seemed chaotic before the announcement. And then bam, here's global tariffs on, allies, potential competitors all at the same time. So part of it, I think, is the messaging. Obviously, what they're trying to do is incredibly significant. It's being driven by political timelines, in my view, because they've only got 4 years, and I think they know that they're time limited here. So trying to fundamentally realign the global trading system in 4 years is a monumental task. They haven't messaged it clearly. So what we're seeing is shock. We're going to see, an absolutely bumpy transition. But I think they can get there. I contrast this with the last time we've had a major realignment. And the last major realignment was the Uruguay round that established modern day WTO. That's where the NAFTA came out of. So we've had major realignments before. That one seemed a little bit more, maybe in hindsight, as we speak 30 years back, there was obviously fierce debates about that, but there were debates about it. We've sort of gone the other way now, where there's going to be tariffs, and now we're going to renegotiate what the new world order will be. So it's kind of a shock and awe type of approach, which is incredibly difficult. But we are going to start seeing, I think, hopefully, things kind of settle down a little bit. And then we're going to see those negotiations progress. Generally speaking, I don't think it's great to negotiate at gunpoint, and I think that's what they've set up to do. They want very quick negotiations here to get to an outcome that is somewhat undefined. But I think that's what we're sort of seeing: a new trade and security pact that's going to be formed in and along the lines of the next few years.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because the Prime Minister spoke this morning at 11:30, and this is what we'll talk about here. This is a quote from Prime Minister Carney, that the deepening integration with the United States is over. That's basically how he started his comments, and that the tariffs that were imposed by the United States on Canada are still viewed by the Canadian government as unjustified. So the existing retaliatory surtaxes that are presently in effect in Canada will remain in effect. So just to remind the listeners, that was the list one, tranche one, of approximately $30 billion, plus another $29.8 billion on steel and aluminum tariffs, and they will remain in effect. There was another announcement this morning on auto. The Canadian government is going to release a 25% tariff on U.S. automotive vehicles. And that package is approximately $8 billion. The details hadn't been released by at the point of this discussion. So listeners should be paying attention to that if you're in the auto sector. And basically, Canada is matching the U.S. approach, where non-USMCA vehicles will be assessed of U.S. origin of 25%. And then if it is a USMCA qualified vehicle, only the U.S. content will be assessed. And then Mexico has a distinct carve out. This does not impact Mexico. But I think, again, I think everyone in the trade community is still waiting for the details, right? Like devil's in the details, right? What's the rules? What's the methodology, the calculation of the origin, things of that. And I would hope they'd be the same.
You hope they'd be the same. And we've already said that Mexican content would be excluded. So there's going to be, I think, maybe some differences that will be unique to Canada. But yet the devil is always in the details with these things. And
I think everyone in the trade community, at least on the Canadian side, was hoping that all of this activity was leading us to a table, right? To a negotiation table. And the Prime Minister today did not go as far as to say that we would be heading to a USMCA table. What he discussed was a partnership discussion should his government form government after April 28th to get to a higher level alignment with the President of the United States on, the new relationship between the United States and Canada. And I think for traders out there on both sides of the border, those conversations are likely going to set up USMCA, right?
Very much so. And I think we're starting to see, some things settle. What we have is an acknowledgement that the USMCA is of core importance, right? USMCA originating goods, they are not, not subject to tariffs, at least at this point in time. So we've gotten some progress there. We do have some areas where even USMCA qualifying products are being subject to tariffs. So those are some of the autos, obviously steel and aluminum. And I think that's sort of setting out the battlegrounds for what will be the negotiation. And that's going to be incredibly tough because, at the end of the day, that means jobs, right? We have steel production here. Aside from industrial policy, where we just want that in our country, we have fundamentally supported jobs in the auto sector and in the steel sector for years and years and years. These are, core to, regional identities in the country. If you look at, Southern Ontario, if you look at, some of the big steel plants, and obviously the aluminum corridor in Quebec, core industrial activities that have really defined those areas.
Yeah. And I think that getting to a table is the best path here to prosperity. I don't think Canada, at least at the moment, is interested in negotiating sectoral by sectoral rules like that. There's apparently activity forthcoming on semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, lumber, etc. I think the Prime Minister's comments today were very clear that they're looking to get this to one comprehensive table, one discussion, and they'll hash it out there, right? So I guess that would be one of the things that we can leave the listeners with a little bit of pleasantry, that I was very surprised yesterday, and I was very pleased to see that USMCA was treated distinctly in that rule. And so that seems to me a very positive sign. Did you get the same impression?
Definitely a positive sign for Canada and for Mexico as well. And, that might be the path forward, right? Where we're saying we're really going to look at USMCA. We can kick the tires on, things like rules of origin, right? Like, the United States is obviously has very clear direction to the CPP of saying we're going to start actually enforcing this and enforcing this with vigor, which is fine. Those are rules that are there. People should be following them. Maybe enforcement hasn't been, up to the levels that that you would expect previously, but now I think everyone's got the message. Or the rules of origin are very important. But I think that, it may tip the hat at the path forward for what this is. We're really going to look at rules of origin. We might tinker with those more, particularly in select sectors, right? That might be in, obviously, autos, that might be in steel, that might be in, we might see different rules and, more comprehensive rules in certain sectors. But certainly a positive, sign for Canada as to the way forward. Well, at the same time, realizing that, the existing tariffs on, steel and aluminum autos are going to have a significant impact.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be interesting to see once the election is concluded, when those high level discussions take place, and whether they're going to be able to settle that prior to getting to a table. I think that's one of the outcomes we're all waiting for. So I guess one of the things I guess we should say to the listeners is stay tuned. Right. This is going to be here for a while. And again, I think my sense of this is stay nimble, right? Stay nimble. Supply chain resiliency at this point in time is excruciatingly important. That's the kind of thing I had in my mind. Any recommendations your side?
Yeah, supply chain resiliency is obviously key for us on the Canadian side. It's we've avoided potentially the worst case scenario on the reciprocal tariffs. But what we do know at this point is USMCA origin is going to be scrutinized by CPP. We also know, and many Canadian companies will have this. This has now an additional issue on their dockets is the origin of your goods. There are so many companies that are selling into the United States. So you might be importing into Canada, widget A, good B, or good something like that, and then selling down to the United States. Those are now susceptible to potentially the global tariffs and potentially the country specific tariffs. So not only is origin for trade agreement purposes very important, but origin generally speaking, knowing where your goods are coming from has now reached an incredibly heightened level of importance for Canadians, but now obviously anyone selling into the United States at this point in time.
Yeah, USMCA qualification hit all those traders that were on MFN, right? They never made the move. And so, USMCA qualification documents now are of primary importance. Well, thanks for spending 30 minutes of your day with us. I know things are a little crazy. Sean's you're coming to the conference, right?
We'll be at the conference.
Yeah. I mean, November 18th through 20th, we're going to be in Ottawa. The IE Canada's annual summit. We're going to have a great panel. Sean usually helps out. We're going to have a lot of interesting international discussions today. And I want to thank our guys at the Global Training Center for helping us out with this. And hey, well, that's great, guys. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.